have...
Yeah, no, I've been totally open for 40 years. Although what that means, the definition of living openly, I think changes over time. Well, you know, just to put my own life into perspective, I was born in 1942. I'm not part of the baby boomers. I'm older than the baby boomers, which has been a great advantage in these years, because as society prepares for the onslaught of the baby boomers on the system, and they cut back on the system in anticipation of that increase in numbers, I'm just ahead of that. So, but I grew up during the Eisenhower era, during the 50s. I went to school during the 50s. I graduated from high school in 1960, so my education career started in the 40s and spanned the entire 50s. Think of who were presidents then, you know? I mean, you started with Truman, but Eisenhower was a big chunk of it, and I can remember when Queen Elizabeth was coronated, because it was broadcast on TV live across the ocean, and that was a major step at the time. And I remember, of course, it was in black and white, but it was alive, you know, and that was a wonder. And so anyway, think of Ozzie and Harriet, and think of that kind of standard and standardized family. That's what I grew up in, and that was Warwick, middle-class suburb. We were a lower middle class, and you know, lived that life. So that's the person who went to college in 1960, Trinity College in Hartford. It was an all-male school at the time, about 1,200 men. And my freshman year, I was elected the chairman and the president of the Young Republicans Club on campus. Trinity was a very tweedy, Irish, Ivy League, small Ivy kind of college. And I campaigned actively for Richard Nixon in 1960 and thought that the country was going to hell in a handbasket when Kennedy won the election. That's who I was in 1960. I was a product of my environment, I was a product of my age, I was a product of the Eisenhower years, and everything that typifies, both good and bad. But that was a great change. And I remember when that changed for me. I was so immaturely focused on the rituals of Hell Week, which wasn't much hell in our fraternity. It was quite a soft kind of use of the time. But at any rate, you know, these pledges were supposed to be doing certain things, and and Kennedy got shot, and I'm trying to continue to keep the routine going, kind of mindlessly, I guess, until one of the pledges turned to me and said, "Fish, aren't you ever going to grow up?" That pledge's name was Christian Messenger, believe it or not. No joke. And that was like cold water. And all of a sudden I was watching the tube through very different eyes. And I saw the world differently from that point on. And that was the moment of radicalization for me. What happened the summer between junior and senior year was a summer job called an executive training program. They called it with Vicks Vapor Rub, Richardson Vicks, and they hired 30 college kids my age for the summer. They recruited all over the country, though. It was very competitive to get into this thing. And what they did was they gave you a week of training in Atlanta. Atlanta? What the hell am I doing in Atlanta? Peachtree Street. And so we got this training on how to sell Vicks Vapor Rub and this package deal they sold every summer to retail druggists, back when there were retail druggists, you know, before the chains ate everything up. And so after a week of training, we got set loose with a rental car, Wow, my own car, and a list of contacts that you were to call on and attempt to sell the package, this year's package, to these guys. They looked forward to the VIX kit every year. They knew we were coming with the deal, and they wanted to know what it was. So it was kind of cool. Well, my area for the month of July was western South Carolina, western North Carolina, a touch of eastern North Carolina, around in Virginia Beach, that area, and then I went out to the Midwest for a month in southern Minnesota, western Illinois, and that area. And this was all very eye-opening for me. This is the most traveling I had ever done outside of Rhode Island in my life, and I kind of liked it. But it was also a culturally expanding experience because I was living in the South then, at a time while segregation was still in force, and there were the signs, you know, whites only and so forth. And particularly where I was. Think of it, western South Carolina. Shit, man, that's where you still don't want to go. You know, and you don't want to hear banjos in the background, you know? I mean, it's a kind of a scary place. Then it was like a trip back in time. And I remember being in that car, that rental car, that summer, I think at that time, where was I? North Carolina or Virginia, and listening to MLK's famous speech live on the radio, AM of course, you know, and being moved by it then. But that was like a milestone along the way to being radicalized. And I came out while I was teaching, during my last year of teaching. I was 26, I guess, and when I say came out, I mean that I came out as a gay person and began to participate in gay society, which at that time for me consisted essentially of gay bars in downtown Providence, and a group of social friends that I met initially from a bar, but became it was another whole social set. And that was the first time I'd ever seen gay social sets. You know, I didn't know that, you know, 8 or 10 men would get together and have dinner on a Saturday night, you know. That never occurred to me. So I had this opportunity to go to Boston, and I moved to Boston. I was there for about 9 furious months. It was a great time. It was, again, a time of a lot of social unrest. I recall, well, anyway, after 9 months there, I was offered a job for the main office of Fairchild Publications in New York City. And I thought, hell yeah. So I moved to New York City. Now that occurred, one funny little anecdote, just at that time of moving to New York City. I had a car while I was living in Boston. I lived on Beacon Street, and I knew what the parking regulations were and so forth, and so I made sure that my car was moved at the right time and so forth. Well, I was moving to New York like April 15th or something like that, and this was now like early April 5th or somewhere thereabouts, early April. And I walked home from work, and my car wasn't where I left it. And it was within the time frame. I said, what the fuck, my car got stolen. So I called the Boston police. I said, no sir, it wasn't stolen, it was towed. You'll find it in the lot down on Albany Street. What for? You'll have to go down there to find out. Well, I had to get down there, first of all. You know, if you don't have a car, how do you get to Albany Street? You know, it's down underneath where the highway used to be, down below the south end and heading toward South Boston. You know, in a really grim area underneath the highway. So I get down there, and they had towed it because my Rhode Island registration expired on March 31st. And for like 4 or 5 days, they picked up and towed the car. And I'm selling the car. I'm moving to New York. My mother's selling the car for me in Rhode Island. And they fucking towed the car. And I was rip shit. I was rip shit. So I get down there, I paid the damn fine. It was a lot of money in those days. I don't know, it was like 75 bucks. And I get in the car and I turn on the radio and I hear there's a riot going on in Cambridge. The police have closed down Mass Ave. There's tear gas. It's an anti-war riot. So I got in the car. I drove over to Cambridge as fast as I could. Went down Mass Ave. The cops are stopping the traffic. I pointed to the press sign that was on my car because I was selling for the Daily News Record, and I got this little press sign. It was just a decal. It said press. It wasn't anything official, I pointed to it and they waved me through and I drove through the goddamn police line, got down, parked my car, got out, picked up and joined the anti-war group, threw a couple of tear gas canisters back at the enemy. The pigs, because I was so fucking pissed with the pigs at that time, That was crazy. But when I moved to New York, there was more anti-war stuff to take part in, and as I moved to New York, it was also the beginning of the gay rights movement. So I moved to New York in 1969. That's contemporaneous with Stonewall, and I was, while I wasn't there for the Stonewall Riots per se, I was there for the first gay pride parade the next year that marked that. And as it went down Fifth Avenue, I did not participate, but I did go and spectate because I didn't know what any of this shit was about. I mean, I was out by that time. I had had my time in Boston, which was a great coming out experience for me because now I'm living on my own in a city where nobody knows me and I'm anonymous. I don't have family to worry about or any of that sort of stuff. I could really be me for the first time. And New York City just offered a great and expanded opportunity to explore myself in a lot of different ways, including as I come to know myself as a gay man and what being out meant. And so it was pretty cool to live there then, in a lot of ways, because it was living a lot of history. Because at that time, police were still raiding the bars, particularly in the Village and in the over by the meatpacking district. Later became Tony Chelsea, but it was not uncommon to be in a bar up on the 3rd or 4th floor in one of the warehouses there, having a great time. Remember, this is the disco era, so you can imagine that there's all kinds of dark lights and it's drug, sex, and rock and roll, and and it was not uncommon to have a police crew come barging in with a dozen uniformed officers and so forth, and try to catch you doing something that you shouldn't have been doing or whatever, but they'd clear the place out and everybody would have to leave and so forth, and if you were mouthy, you might get detained, but for the most part, people would just go out and find another bar. But that wasn't the first time. I mean, when I came out in Prague, go back, back up 5 years in Providence, when I came out, same thing was happening in Providence. There were only a few gay bars, and they tended to be on side alleys or whatever. And for the ones that were on a main street, one thing that you knew was when you walked out that door, you opened the door and looked both ways to see who was around, or if nobody was around, before you left the bar. And but I can remember dancing at the Kubla Khan on Weybosset Street. Kubla Khan was one of the old gay bars. It was actually a Chinese restaurant. That was a restaurant on one side, one door said restaurant, the other said lounge. The lounge was a gay bar, and it was separated. The two were separated by a beaded curtain. That was it. And so there was a jukebox on the bar side, and men would be dancing there. But if the music stopped or if the lights flashed, you knew that the cops were coming. Stop dancing, no touching, and make sure you're of age. expectations were so much lower. You know, it's hard to imagine in today's society um, what the people who tended to be social radicals, like myself, and, didn't constitute, you know, 70% of the gay population at all. I mean, it's always been, as it is now, a fairly small group of people who do that social work, that political work. Um, Now, I wanted to go back to I wanted to go back to uh, the story of coming out.
Mm.
I mean, because I believe it's one of those onion peeling experiences that where you're continuing to find. I always thought I continued to find pieces of internalized homophobia inside of myself at unexpected turns in life, including now. And um, so, you know, what does being out mean? Well, when I first came out, as I described it to you, it was coming out into society, going to bars and participating in gay parties. Um, when I went to Boston, it was a lot about the big parties, the big bars. There were big disco dance bars with hundreds of people, and it was unusual at that time, and that was what a lot of it was about. In New York, it was a lot about that, but also more sexual overtones, not undertones, overtones, to a lot of the time in New York City. But again, put it in that time frame. That was pretty much what society was doing. We were leading the sexual revolution. We weren't just living it, you know. And so, what was being out then? Well, that's when political activism became possible through great gay pride and so forth, and what that meant. And when I came back to Rhode Island, um, that was about the beginning of gay pride in Rhode Island. And, you know, in 1976, remember, that's when we went to court to be able to march in the bicentennial parade as the Gay Civil Rights Union, you know. And we had to go to court because Colonel McQueenie, the Providence police chief at the time, wouldn't hear of it. It wouldn't issue a parade permit for us. So, so that, you know, that was what Rhode Island was about. That was also about the time that Anita Bryant was terrorizing Florida with her anti-gay campaigns and so forth, and she was much in the news. And we had a in Providence in the late 70s. We had a movement to get a gay rights ordinance through the city of Providence while Buddy was mayor in his first term, and I can remember attending a city council meeting that was packed with gay activists, or packed with people, including all of us that were gay activists, you know, which was a pretty small group at that point in time, pushing to get this passed. But I can remember participating in those early gay rights pride parades, you know, being a small and daring bunch. But that things kind of coming out was kind of a political act then. But then, for me personally, the next big step in coming out was the AIDS epidemic. When it hit in 1985, or when it hit me in 1985, that was a whole different kind of coming out for me, because I want to tell you the story, if I can. It's September of 1985. Sound like Estelle Getty, you know? Picture this, Sicily, 1963. That fall, the fall of '85, AIDS was just starting to be talked about in an organized fashion in Rhode Island by a small group of mostly gay men and healthcare providers that had started to talk informally about what to do. And I wasn't involved in that other than listening to it a little bit, hearing about it. But that fall, I went to New York City for the first time in 10 years, since I had moved from there. And I was going down to visit a former lover of mine, a guy that I had had about a one-year relationship with between Providence and Boston. He had been a student at RISD when I met him in Providence when I was selling advertising time. He went off to Italy for his senior year abroad. I went to Boston, fell in love with somebody else, and so. But we have still maintained a friendship. Years later, you know. Well, anyway, I went down to New York. I learned that he was in program, and I went down to visit him. Now, in the bus on the way down, I'm thinking, this is really kind of weird. I haven't been back to New York in 10 years. I haven't seen Jonathan in years. I haven't been to a Broadway show in 10 years, and he said there's a couple of them he wants me to see. They're about this AIDS thing. This is really kind of weird. So I get there Friday night, and I'm sitting in Jonathan's apartment in Chelsea, and I'm chatting and talking about this AIDS thing. And I said, well, I mean, how big a thing is this, Jonathan? I mean, you know people? He says, oh yeah, and he started reeling off names. And he was up to about 24 before I was stunned, you know, that was amazing to me, to think that it was that prevalent. And the next afternoon, Saturday afternoon, we went to an AA meeting in New York, and during the break I was talking with this guy that I met, and HIV came up. Not HIV, it wasn't HIV then, AIDS came up. And he said, yeah, I remember the first person I knew that died. It was a model named Joe. And I said, Joe? Joe who? Joe McDonald? He said, yeah. I said, oh my God, that was the first person I knew who had died. I didn't know he had died. And I had not been intimate with Joe, but I had worked with him for a week down in Haiti on a particular shoot. He was a really nice guy. So I was pretty stunned by that. That night, I went to see As Is on Broadway. Jonathan had gotten me a ticket. I went alone. And I was emotionally wrought by that play. I sat and sobbed for 20 minutes after the curtain went down. The place was empty by the time I could bring myself together to get up and walk out. And I walked back and down Broadway to Jonathan's in Chelsea and thought about it all the way down there. And the next day, he had tickets for me for the Normal Heart in Circle in the Square. And I went to that and went through another emotional catharsis, a different range of emotions, more anger and political this time. Larry Kramer, how could it not be? You know, but I remember walking into the Circle in the Square, and I remember how it was set up, theater in the ground, and the walls of the theater all the way around of the audience area were all painted black with white names painted on them, just names, hundreds and hundreds of names of people who had died of AIDS. And it was impossible for me, at least, I imagine perhaps for others, to not be in there and be searching. I mean, I remember I had been out of the city for 10 years. This had started to ravage New York. I wonder how many of my friends I didn't know about. I had already heard about Joe. I mean, how many more, you know? And it just so personalized it. And then the play itself was, you know, struck my political chord exactly right. And on, I guess it was Monday, Um, Monday I went home, and that night I made a call to a guy I knew from college in New York City, and I was talking with him, and he said, "Well, you knew about Noel, right?" I said, "No." And Noel was a young man that I had had a 4 or 5 month relationship with back when I lived in the city. Well, he was a health food nut. He was one of the healthiest people I knew. He was dead, and it just kept driving closer and closer. And I got home, and Tuesday night I decided to call my former lover, who was living in Houston, Texas. Uh, this is the man I had fallen in love with in New York City and come back and lived with for about 8 years. But there were about 3 or 4 years of non-contact there, and I knew he had moved to Houston, so I called him out of the blue, and I could tell there was something in his voice. He had been diagnosed that day, and it just tore me apart. And it was like, all right, universe, I got the fucking message. Give me a break here. I had to do something. I had to do something. And I called Bob Hitt, because his name I had associated with this informal group that had gotten together, was getting together, and I told him what had happened, and I wanted to get involved with it, whatever it meant. And what do you need? And he said, well, it's like 3 things we need. We need an office, we need a telephone, and we need money. I walked across the street to the State House, where one of my students from Cranston West was Fred Vincent, who was then the Chief of Staff to Governor Dupree. And I walked in, and, oh, hi, Mr. Fish, how are you? And I said, hi, Fred, how are you? He said, what can I do for you? I said, well, let me tell you. So I sat down, I said, we've got this AIDS thing going on, and we need office space. And I'm over there in the Roger Williams building. I mean, he said, let me see what I can do. He called me back the next day, and we had room 124 assigned to us, which was a long, narrow, just a skinny little building, but it was enough. Andy got a telephone for us, so we had the beginnings of an office and an AIDS hotline. That was the beginning of 6 years of very intense work with AIDS for me. That's the part that to come back to the theme of coming out, that was very much of a coming out experience for me, because of my activity with the AIDS Project became the subject of TV news, and the Projo, back when it had pages, and reporters. And so I kind of became the public face of the project for a while. That was a whole different coming out experience for me, particularly given the ignorance around AIDS at the time. You know, when the AIDS Project got that little space in the Roger Williams building, not everybody was happy about that, including upper echelon administrators at the Department of Education, at the level of deputy commissioner. So there was some work to be done, and it took a lot of balls to be that public about it, and to be that insistent about it, and to be a public advocate for what needed to be done in the face of public resistance to that way of thinking. I also was a buddy for 4 different men that died, as well as starting the buddy program, because once we got the funding for it, we needed a buddy program. Bob Hitt and I teamed up, and we went to Boston, got trained in the buddy program there, came back and replicated it here. And then there was the support group that Margaret Smith, who's a licensed social worker, and myself ran for about 3 years. This was a support group for people with AIDS, and it was at a time when there weren't any effective treatments. And we worked intensely once a week with this group of people. There were 38 of them that went through that group. And we walked the journey with all of them. as a group, and Margaret and I as co-leaders, and eventually had to stop it. We couldn't sustain that. We couldn't sustain it. When I learned about Paul's diagnosis, that's what propelled me into this. And I knew that, I just knew at that time that he would end up coming back to Rhode Island, and there were no supports in place for him. And that was part of what propelled me to get involved, to help to create the supports that were necessary. He did come back to Rhode Island. He did become a part of that support group, and he did die here. I guess it was in '91, and it was. I came out a lot. I learned a lot during all that period of time. Terrible lessons, but life shaping, values forming. And so that was I came out publicly more, and it was enabling, because when I came out publicly, that kind of freed me up to do more of the same. Once you find out you can get away with this shit, you can do more of it, until somebody makes you, till it hurts, in some way. And it was at that point that I kind of realized, I've been blessed with a lot in life, and if something needed to be done, why not me? I mean, that was part of the ethic that I had acquired in the '60s and early '70s, and you're either part of the solution or part of the problem, and so I'd pitch in to help. And it just seems my destiny sometimes to end up being having leadership responsibilities in doing these things, and I've come to embrace that about myself. I like to start things. That's what I like to do. I don't like to run them for very well. I'm going to pass it on to somebody else, and on to the next challenge, whatever that happens to be. And so during the '90s, it was more. That's when we got the Board of Regents to approve the non-discrimination policy for kids. It was also when we got our gay rights legislation through the General Assembly. And that was a lot more. That was more political, and I played supporting roles in most of that. Not so much leadership roles. But it's been a constant issue, and it continues today. And today, for me today, being out and being a gay advocate for me means participating in Youth Pride, where I'm currently the chairman of the board, reluctantly so, filling in until the next election, and supporting our gay youth. It means working for marriage equality in Rhode Island, because to me that's the great civil rights issue of our time. That's the next big step. It's something that I certainly could never have conceived of when I was, being harassed in a Providence gay bar in 1968. It's not something I could ever have imagined. But now I see it as one of the last blocks to fall, and last legal blocks to fall. That, together with DOMA, and we're well on our way to having achieved the kind of broad-based equality that has been lacking for so long. Enough exceptionalism. Let's get to the broad-based fundamental beliefs behind the whole thing, and stop being hypocrites and picking and choosing, cherry picking how we look at things. What I look forward to politically, passage of marriage equality, and on to the repeal of DOMA. I could die a happy man if those two things happen. No, we have durable power of attorney documentation that we've had for years and so forth that should protect our rights. And as I read the Civil Unions Bill and the noxious Corvasia amendment to it, I have fewer rights now than I had before the damn law passed. because at that time there was no religious exemption for people paying attention to a durable power of attorney or any other legal document. Now, I'm not so sure about that. I think they carved out an exemption that did not exist prior to civil unions. How's that for progress? Well, you know,
Is it
it's a lot of the same voices coming from the same corner of society, and they're chanting a lot of the same shit. Yes, it hasn't changed much. Hate is still hate, you know, 40 years later, and you know it still cloaks itself in religious authority and makes pronouncements that hurt the lives of people. So yeah, it's a lot of the same stuff. Dance with David Bowie. You know.
Really?
Yeah, in a bar one night. Big club. So, you know, crazy times.